Dr. Gary Fettke is an orthopedic surgeon from Tasmania, and he became really interested in the much broader question of carbohydrates and their cause of ill health. And in this lecture, he will discuss his understanding of how high carbohydrate diets don't just cause obesity and diabetes, but they may be implicated in a much wider range of chronic diseases.
If you just look at that first slide, sugar makes you hungry, carbohydrates make you fat, polyunsaturated oils make you inflamed and sick. If you can read that and understand it, you can all go home now. Just want to do something here. I hope you realise that we're all going to die. The question is, are you going to die old or are you going to die sick? So if you can just help me here, long talks today, everyone just stand up for a second, please. Stretch those legs out a little bit. Now I want you to look around and I want you to, just every third person, sit down. All right, just every third person, just roughly every third person. Okay. Now, like, I don't want to put the mockers on you, but a third of you are going to die of diabetes-related illness. Okay? Another third, sit down. You're all going to die of cancer. And the rest of you can sit down now. You're all going to die of inflammatory related disease. Now, I'm the only one still standing. So you might want to listen to me. When Tim Noakes asked me to come along and speak about the disease-causing effects of high carbohydrate diets, he's asked me to speak about all modern disease. That's a little topic. Then tomorrow he's asked me to speak about cancer, so that's another little topic. But when he asked me, I was not only honoured, but the only thing I could really respond with was lacquer. At this summit, you're hearing about the Association of Processed Food. You're hearing about a lot about what it's about, but I'm going to try and tell you how this processed food has occurred. I think we've made it too difficult when we say that it's all carbohydrate. I don't think it is. I think it's a combination of sugar, carbohydrate and refined and polyunsaturated oils. And just like fireworks, each one of those elements is actually fairly safe. But if you put all of those things together in just the wrong combination and in the frequency and amounts that we have, then you've got a highly inflammatory process. So I don't want to try and convince you that I'm right or any of us are right here. What my job today is, in my mind, is to plant a seed of doubt in your minds that what you've been doing for the last 10, 20, 30 years, if you've been following guidelines and what your university-based education was, that it might in fact be entirely wrong. And that's exactly what happened to me. After today, start researching for yourself. Go on the journey. That's exactly what I did. And surprise, surprise, here I am. So you wonder why there's an orthopaedic surgeon talking about, nutrition and stuff. Osteoarthritis of the knee is totally out of control. Obesity-related osteoarthritis of the knee. I'm the first surgeon in Australia to refuse to do joint replacement if people are too heavy. Took that stand a few years ago. BMI is more than 35, go away and lose weight. Quite a controversial stand. I've had to justify that. I've been able to tell 130 knee surgeons at a meeting last year that they were all negligent, and I'm still here. But rather than tell them just to go away and lose weight, I said, I've got some options here for you. This is what you can do for your own health. I'm also the surgeon in northern Tasmania who looks after most of the diabetic foot complications. So if you need your foot chopped off or your leg chopped off or little bits of your anatomy chopped off, I'm the person. My first operation of 2015 was to do a thing called where I took off a guy's entire arm at the shoulder level for a diabetes-related condition. That was the start of 2015. The system is failing under lifestyle-related disease. Okay? It is happening. Any of you who work in the health system will be well and truly aware of that. But forget all about that. This story is about me. My early years, I was raised on sugar, refined carbohydrate and polyunsaturated oil. I was a fat, pimply kid. I was eating by the food pyramid, and I think I started to look like the food pyramid. I worked hard to lose weight, but I was still a toffee. You've heard of that term, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. I was pre-diabetic in retrospect. I was metabolically inflamed. I think that was all related to diet. Well, I thought I had enough on my plate, but I thought 15 years ago I should have a brain tumour. I had a massive tumour on my pituitary, required a craniotomy, radiotherapy and chemotherapy. And because of that pituitary tumour, I developed an acute interest in endocrinology. As you do, it's called survival. But I'm not the first orthopaedic surgeon to dabble in the field of endocrinology. Some of you may know this Canadian orthopaedic surgeon, Frederick Banting, not the William Banting that we've been heralding today. In 1921, he developed insulin, won the 1923 Nobel Prize. Trying to work out if Banting 1 would approve of Banting 2 and vice versa. So over the last few years, I've developed what I call the nutritional model of modern disease. So I'm going to try and explain all of this, all modern disease, in this next 45 minutes. So we're going to have to try and do that by considering that I think the combination of sugar, and particularly fructose, refined carbohydrate and polyunsaturated oils combine together to be a toxic material. So I'm going to try and justify that by my model. I'm going to have to talk about an observation, some hypothesis, the mechanism, the pathophysiology, how to do it, some association evidence and intervention evidence. So here are a few observations. We got to the top of the food chain over 2.5 million years by eating in one way. And I think we've been on a fad diet for the last 40 or 50 years, and that social experiment is a clear failure, and we're getting fatter and sicker than ever. So you've got to ask why. Obesity is increasing, cancer is increasing. I don't know if you don't quite know what's happening in South Africa, but in Australia, children's cancer is going up 3% per annum, year in, year out. Osteoarthritis is increasing, joint disease is increasing, gout has doubled in the last 10 years, related to high levels of uric acid, and I'll explain that in a bit of biochemistry later. There's doubling rate of gout, despite the fact that we're actually eating less red meat and drinking less alcohol. Autoimmune disease, also increasing. Mental health, increasing burden, and the spectrum is right from autism right through to dementia. On and on and on. Every condition, every subspecialty, there's an increasing rate of problems. Welcome to modern disease. So what does medicine do about it? It's highly reactive. Right? It doesn't think about the cause, it just throws pills at it. Focuses on the disease rather than the cause. And that's coming at a massive personal and medical cost to society. Our hospitals are bursting at the seams, and with a lot of junk food within them. It's financially unsustainable. There's a lot of talk about when that point will be. I looked at this, gave a paper about 4 or 5 years ago now on the economic cost of diabetes, of looking after well diabetic patients within the Australian system. I'm not talking about any complications, I'm not talking about an ulcer, I'm not talking about heart disease, anything. But looking after well diabetics, we will spend the entire Australian health budget looking after well diabetics within 20 years. And I was accused of being, oh, that's a little bit over, dramatic. And I said, well, actually, I've modelled it at only 40% of the expected number. So I was being ultra conservative with my number. And all you've got to do is look around the hospitals, and they're straining at the bit now. And from my discussions with colleagues from South Africa, the same situation is here. So I think we're all lemmings about to go over the edge of the cliff. A few of us are making a bit of noise and pushing and shoving. And I think we need to get back to prevention. So if any of you would like to grab a parachute before we go over the edge of the cliff, that's what this talks about. Let's go back to the start. It really is our only option. So that's my observations. But I've got to come up with a hypothesis for you. So I think at the root cause of all disease is inflammation, whether or not it's cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity. And you'll keep hearing those terms coming through over and over in the next few days. Now, if we can find out the cause of that inflammation, then we're on the very first step to prevention. And maybe we've got a new handle on modern disease. So, clearly inflammation's there. What's the cause of that inflammation? I need to find that toxic material, and in my mind, my hypothesis rests that it's a combination of fructose, refined carbohydrate and polyunsaturated oils. But as quite rightly has been said, I think it's not just that. I think that's the big print. If we get that big picture stuff together, clearly other stuff's involved. If you develop a susceptible organ because it's chronically inflamed, then the other things come in. And that's when cortisol comes in. There are genetic predispositions. We heard about hyperlipidemia. All the chemicals that are floating around in society. There's an enormous amount of work being done on the gut biotome at the moment, trying to work out what that plays in there. Exercise or lack thereof can play a role. And we know there's associations with disease with latitude and longitude. Multiple sclerosis is quite common in Tasmania. So in a southern climate, where it's a lot less common as you get towards the equator. We know that diabetes in the Polynesian islands increases that susceptibility as you go from west to east, as you travel further across the Pacific. So there's associations there. I always think that sleep's a factor, and I like to openly admit that I'm a clear hypocrite of that and I don't get enough. I'll explain where vitamin D comes into the equation. Even artificial lighting's been implicated in disease. So that's the hypothesis. I'm going to talk about the mechanism now. I'm going to talk about what each of these factors are. Where does sugar, carbohydrate and polyunsaturated oils fit in the overall equation? We need to go back to the engine of the body. The engine of the cell is the mitochondria. It's the powerhouse. Most of you don't realise it's actually a hybrid engine. Most people, maybe not in this audience, but most people in society have only been running along on one fuel tank, on their glucose engine, and have been well and truly underutilising their ketone engine. But it is a hybrid engine. Glucose, ketones, both of those are converted in the mitochondria to acetyl-CoA and then into energy via the Krebs cycle. Now, remembering I'm an orthopaedic surgeon, I'm not going to show you lots of complicated biochemical pathways, and we're much better at actually understanding pictures. So if you haven't worked out already that I'm fairly simple, here we go, all right? This is orthopaedic biochemistry. You get some glucose, stick it into a mitochondria, and you get out some ATP, all right? About 36 for every unit of glucose. Ketones do the same thing, turn into acetyl-CoA. The mitochondria doesn't care where the fuel source is for acetyl-CoA, as long as it gets it. And again, that converts it to ATP. Now, here's some more pictures, all right? There are only 3 primary colours, right? Red, blue, yellow. And the combination of those makes up the entire colour spectrum. Well, guess what? There's only 3 primary foods. And combining them gives us the full spectrum of nutrition. That's how we combine them seasonally, that we can actually work out where our fuel sources are. So all foods are converted to energy in the mitochondria. Carbohydrate gets the big red one, protein the blue, and the fat's yellow. The trick is get the balance right between the 3 of them. And in nature, I think it's reflected in seasonal eating. Another way to look at all that fuel is carbohydrate, I think, is kindling. Little branches, you've got to put lots of them on regularly, got to get up and down, fire goes up, fire goes down, needs a lot of insulin, goes up, got to come down. It's a lot of work to keep carbohydrate going into your engine. Protein, I think, are like branches, and fats like slow-burning logs. You put a slow-burning log into the engine, slow fuel keeps us all going. So I'm going to dwell on each one of these. Carbohydrates are effectively either just glucose or fructose. Most of the glucose comes in either the breads, the rice, the pastas, cereals, potato, and the milk products in the lactose. Whereas fructose comes as in the form of either fruit or as in sugar. But they're all carbohydrates. Amylase breaks all of those carbohydrates down, starting in your saliva, and by the time it reaches your gut, you've pretty well got a glucose load coming into the system. Sure, it's slowed by fibre content and decreases gives us a lower GI. But effectively, glucose is glucose. Right? It doesn't matter what form it comes in. It's metabolised pretty quickly. It goes from the gut under the influence of insulin. It's then distributed around the body. It goes to the brain, the liver, and the muscle. But it's been mentioned earlier today. So this is all those other pictures, the biochemical pathways you've seen earlier today, just in pictures, because I find it a lot simpler. There's only about 4 grams in the blood supply at any point in time. So under the effect of insulin, it's distributed around the body, and if you have more than 4 grams, if you have more than 1 teaspoon, it gets distributed as fat. What does that mean if you have a piece of bread? Well, one slice of bread's got 5 teaspoons of sugar, of glucose. One of them goes around your bloodstream, the other 4 go straight onto your backside. You have that bowl of pasta, 15 to 20 teaspoons of glucose, right? 1 around the bloodstream, 7.5 on each cheek on the backside. Same thing goes with rice. Even the old humble spud, 1 standard sized potato, about 6 teaspoons of glucose. Whereas sugar, fructose, we start looking at that a bit differently. Most of you are unaware that, and certainly I was, in my training, I had no idea what happened to fructose, but it was actually only described pretty well definitively in 2010 by Luke Tappy. So anybody talks to me about biochemistry and they haven't quoted beyond 2010, they're out of date. So that puts virtually every guideline talking about sugar out of date, because none have really been published much since 2010. So fructose is not just half of sugar. It's found in fruit, it's found in honey, high fructose corn syrup, about 55% fructose. And I have a problem with fruit. I have a website called No Fructose. And it's a regular question. We all get that question, what about fruit? And I say, it's really simple. Fruit nowadays has been manufactured with less fibre in it and more sugar. It improves shelf life and transportability. So a lot of our fruit's manufactured. It's treated in chemicals, gassed, before it ever gets near us. So I'll come back to about fruit maybe a little bit later in questions. All right, what are the sources of protein? Well, eggs, chicken, nuts, lamb, and what's that big pink thing? Pigs, yeah, and fish. Scattering amongst it, but as was mentioned yesterday, we find fat in virtually the same things as well. Okay, so it's really a mixed bag, protein and fat, the sources of it. But our healthy fats come also in dairy and the cheeses. Coming back to the colours again, all right. Carbohydrate, glucose, equals a rapid rise in glucose in the bloodstream. It also requires a rapid response of insulin. Protein also requires a bit of an insulin response, pushes up the blood glucose. And you see my line for fat isn't flat. It is if we just had purely fat, but we very rarely find fat just as fat in the system. So virtually always it comes as a bit of a mixture with a little bit of protein, a little bit of carbohydrate. So I do think you get a little bit of blood glucose spike with the fats that we normally eat in a traditional meal. And we also get a low-grade insulin response, but it's pretty well minimal in comparison. So again, kindling requires a massive amount of insulin to bring it back under control, and slow-burning logs don't. Some other culprit are polyunsaturated oils. You've noticed that margarine's been made to look like butter, coloured like butter, consistency like butter. Why don't we just have butter? Vegetable oils, right? Do they exist? You ever tried to get an oil out of a vegetable? Right? That's called marketing, right? They're seed oils. Nothing more or less, they're seed oils. So the difference between a fat and oil is what it is at room temperature. A fat's solid at room temperature and an oil is liquid. And as humans, we're floating along at roughly 37 degrees, and that means that the oil we have within us, our saturated fat, is in fact liquid. A cold day, we become a lot more solid. I realise it's warm weather here today, but you should have seen Jay, I suppose, if he was in the snow the other day, it would have been a lot rigid. So why does a plant need an oil in it that's flexible and liquid at room temperature? Well, the obvious thing is that at cold temperatures that plant would freeze up and it'd get no nutritional mobility up and down the plant. And it does that, or creates that mobility, because of double bonds within it. So the more double bonds you have within an oil, the more flexibility it is, and it will be liquid at a lower temperature. And that all comes with survival of a plant. The trouble is, with each one of those double bonds, it's a point of weakness, it's a point of oxidation. And in the presence of oxygen, that actually can form oxygen-free radicals. So what does that mean? Oxidation is like rust. Okay, you see a bit of steel outside, oxidises, becomes rust. It's highly inflammatory. And with each one of those steps in that process, the more polyunsaturated oil we have in the body, the more double bonds we've got in it, the more inflammation occurs. So I think that inflammation is there as our mechanism, and the oxidation, and particularly the oxygen-free radicals, are the thing that I'm after. So let's do a bit of pathophysiology. That's always a good term. It took me 30 years to get interested in biochemistry, by the way. Let's look how the pieces of the jigsaw fit together. And I thank Robert Lustig for this image of a liver cell. Okay, it's quite complicated, but I'm going to put pictures in and out of it which will make it simple for us. Fructose comes in on the top left there. The very first thing it does is it replenishes glycogen if there's a depletion. Remembering that most times fructose comes in with glucose, and glucose is preferred to go into the glycogen straight away. So not much goes down that pathway in a normal Western diet. There's an aldehyde pathway, okay, that's called making alcohol. And if you make too much alcohol and you ingest too much alcohol, you end up with cirrhosis, you end up with liver damage. It's one of the mechanisms in the pathways in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It's an interesting byproduct of fructose is a thing called uric acid. Most people are unaware of it. I've had arguments with people until you say, okay, look, here it is, fructose is converted to uric acid. So on the simplistic side, we'll leave it at that. But uric acid is a potent inhibitor of nitric oxide. Might have heard of nitric oxide. There are three forms of nitric oxide. There's a neuronal form of nitric oxide which maintains our blood supply to the brain. Remember, the brain's the last part of the body to shut down. So it's got an incredible protective effect, and it works by neuronal nitric oxide. There's also an endothelial nitric oxide, which acts as a potent vasodilator, and an inducible form of nitric oxide, which allows our white cells to do their stuff. I've always wondered how white cells get somewhere. You know, they get all these triggers and they're told to come there, but how do they actually get there? Well, they get there by actually opening up and vasodilating the tissue around them, and that's under the effect of nitric oxide. So if we start inhibiting that, so fructose byproduct, uric acid inhibits nitric oxidase, and we produce less nitric oxide, at the brain level, it decreases brain blood supply, and it's implicated in the cause of dementia and mental health. What happens at the blood vessel? And this is coming back to Dr. Westman's question this morning. I think this is the link for hypertension. If you have too much uric acid in the system, then you're in fact inhibiting endothelial vasodilation, and that accounts for our hypertension. And I think when you come off sugar, then when patients we see come off their antihypertensives, that may be one of the reasons. It also has that inducible form of nitric oxide. When you inhibit that, then you inhibit white cell activity, and it's implicated again in our infections and cancer. And it always surprises me that my patients wake up after an anaesthetic just when I want them to have maximum amounts of oxygen in their tissues and the best immunity on the system, and we give them jelly, ice cream, soft drink, choc chip biscuits, and white sandwiches. That's another battle. It's clearly implicated in insulin resistance, and that's been talked about already today. That insulin resistance is both at the muscle and at the liver level. It's all implicated in being an inhibitor of leptin. And again, we know that leptin is a potent appetite suppressant, and when you inhibit the effect of leptin, then it becomes, in by the reverse fashion, an appetite stimulant. It also has a positive stimulant effect on ghrelin. And ghrelin is that thing which makes your tummy rumble and makes you feel a bit hungry. All of this, I think, is driving us down the hunger path. And it's a very, very elegant pathway, because in nature, fructose is only available at the time of plenty, at the end of summer, beginning of autumn, when fruit's on the trees. And in that scenario, that's exactly when we want to deliberately get fat for winter hibernation. We want to move into scheduled obesity, which is what Professor Richard Johnson talks about. He talks about that concept. And so as an animal, we will deliberately stuff our faces with the fruit on the trees to deliberately get fat for winter. So when we're exposed to fructose, we do exactly the same thing. But the chemical pathways are quite elegant. But I want to dwell upon this pathway, de novo lipogenesis. Okay? All that excessive fructose gets into the liver and ultimately produces small, dense, low-density lipoproteins. All right? Goes through a VLDL pathway, but the ultimate endpoint is small, dense LDLs. Now, there's a spectrum of LDL, which from big, fluffy ones to very small, dense ones, and there's only a very small portion of that spectrum that actually plays a role in that. So what happens if I increase my fructose load? Okay, I start producing more and more LDL particles. Those LDL particles are filled up with cholesterol, triglycerides, fat, protein, and phosphate. And those LDLs are made up, or the fat within them reflects our dietary intake of fat, nothing more or less. So we can take it in the form of a saturated fat, or we can take it in the form of polyunsaturated fat. So if we fill up our LDL particles, our small dense ones, with saturated fat, that's as inflammatory as a brick wall. There are no double bonds to be exposed to oxygen. There's no oxidation which occurs. That's a traditional diet. But if we decide to fill up our low-density lipoproteins with a polyunsaturated oil, and we fill it up with lots and lots of double bonds, they're all points of weakness. It equals more and more oxidation, more and more release of oxygen-free radicals, more inflammation. Now, where do those LDL particles go? Well, they go into the blood vessel wall. And I think this is a beautiful slide by Joan Gill. And it explains everything. And I'll spend a little bit of time on it. At the top, we've got the inside of the blood vessel with the blood floating by, and the LDL particles. Now, if you've got big, fluffy LDL particles, they float by. If you've got small, dense LDLs, I call them the Goldilocks size. They're just the right size to get inside the blood vessel wall and then sit below it. The high-density lipoproteins, the one which go and suck up excessive cholesterol in the blood vessels, they actually get in and out. They're too small to get stuck there. But the small, dense LDLs are the Goldilocks particle. They get into that subintimal layer, they sit there, they become oxidised and inflamed, and then you end up with an inflammatory response, foam cell development, chronic low-grade inflammation. This is a wonderful thing about nature, is that those macrophages that clear out those small dense LDLs in that inflammatory process are under the direct influence of vitamin D. And guess what happens in Mother Nature? When we're exposed in nature to our supply of fructose in the form of seasonal fruit, and our LDL particle goes up naturally in our subintimal layer of the blood vessel, guess what? We're all running around naked outside in the sun, getting our vitamin D, which helps us clear it. So maybe if we want to eat fruit all year round, we have to be out in the sun all year round. Our cell membranes are also made up of phospholipids. It's mostly saturated fat. And again, our cell membrane lipids are purely a reflection of what's in our diet. So it can be filled up with saturated fat, or it can be filled up with polyunsaturated fat. The same thing goes with our mitochondrial membrane. Again, a phospholipid membrane. It can be filled up with a saturated fat or a polyunsaturated fat. I'll come back to that mitochondrial membrane tomorrow in my talk about cancer, because it's a critical point. So again, we've got the choice here. Currently, I believe we're actually increasing the amount of polyunsaturated oil in our low-density lipoproteins, our cell membranes, and our mitochondrial membranes. All those double bonds equal more oxidation and more inflammation. They then sit in the subintimal layer of every blood vessel in every organ of the body. We've created a low-grade chronic inflammatory state in every organ of the body. We've also created that low-grade inflammatory state in every cell in the body and every membrane of every mitochondrial. Now, we're actually doing that to our babies before they're born. And the construction blocks we use as adults are the same thing as we use as our embryos. So in fact, we're building our babies out of pro-inflammatory states, pro-inflammatory materials. But I want to come back again to carbohydrate. Most carbohydrate is glucose, and we've got another carbohydrate called fructose. And in a traditional sense, refined carbohydrate, all carbohydrates get converted to glucose, and our sugar, our sucrose, glucose is glucose and fructose gets converted into low-density lipoproteins. But there's a thing called the polyol pathway, little-known biochemical pathway, and in a natural state there's an endogenous production of fructose from glucose. It's about 3% of glucose that we take in is converted to fructose. That endogenous pathway releases, guess what, some more oxygen-free radicals in the process. Now, 3% conversion isn't really much of a problem, but last year we came across this paper from 1984 where they looked at the polyol pathway in cataracts. So in a group of patients who were hyperinsulinemic, hyperglycemic, had their insulin resistance, they had a 10-fold increase in the amount of production of fructose from glucose. So therefore, what does that mean? Is that when you have carbohydrate, you're not converting 3% of that carbohydrate load into fructose, you're converting 30%, which increases that load of LDL particles massively once again. And that equals more oxygen-free radical production. And where we had a lot more inflammation before, now we've got a truckload more inflammation. And again, it's sitting in the subintimal layer of every blood vessel of the wall, every blood vessel of every organ in the body. And that creates susceptibility. So that's my background of pathophysiology. Have I got any evidence to suggest that this has actually got a role to play? All right, let's again look at sugar, refined carbohydrate, and polyunsaturated oils. In the 1970s, our consumption of fructose started to increase. The top line, the grey line there, is the total. And guess what that means? That means more LDL production that we created in society. What happened to our carbohydrate consumption in the 1970s? Well, that took off as well. And we've seen this graphically represented before. And under the influence of that polyol pathway, that meant not only an increased glucose load, which we've heard discussed as possibly in relationship to insulin resistance, it also meant LDL production was increased. And we're now flooding the system with LDL particles. What happened to our polyunsaturated oil consumption? You can see that purple line there, that's our increased polyunsaturated, in broad terms, vegetable oil consumption. Again, took off in the 1970s. Our consumption of the saturated fats really didn't change. The green line's the margarine one, that actually has decreased a bit, which is quite good. I'm always amazed when I go to the supermarket, there seems to be as much butter as margarine, but whenever I ask my patients if they're taking butter or margarine, they all look at me guiltily and say butter. So I'm trying to work out that the only way the supermarkets can maintain that margarine is it's got a longer shelf life. So that means we've now got more oxidation in those low-density lipoproteins. We've filled them up with pro-inflammatory polyunsaturated oils in amounts that we've never seen before. We've done the same thing with our cell membranes and our mitochondrial membranes. And to me, that's the big issue. Have we got any proof for that? Well, Stefan Giernitz put this graph together looking at linoleic acid levels. That's the omega-6 fatty acids, the pro-inflammatory material, going back from the 1960s, experimental data where they biopsied the fat of US citizens. And there's been a steady increase in the amount of omega-6, pro-inflammatory omega-6 fatty acids, gone up from 8% in the 1960s to around 24 to 25%. And I've heard someone tell me anecdotally that it's as far as 30%, but they haven't published it yet. So we had a 300% increase in the amount of pro-inflammatory fat in our fat in the last 50 years. Same thing's gone with women's breast milk. What we're feeding our babies, what the women in our life feed our babies. I've tried, it didn't work. You don't trick the kids with that. Just put the little baby in, it doesn't work, Dad. That increase is quite dramatic. So it's reflected in the linoleic acid level, which is the omega-6, but not in the linolenic acid level, which is the omega-3s. All of this means that we've created more inflammation in every cell as well as in every organ of the body. And unfortunately, along the way, in all of those biochemical pathways, we've produced more and more oxygen-free radicals. And with that, I think that's quite a toxic combination. Welcome to modern disease. Have we got any intervention evidence for all of this? Well, you'll hear regularly over the next few days that low carbohydrate, healthy fat diets, and I prefer that term healthy fat rather than high fat, decreases weight, decreases cardiovascular risk factors, has a role to play in most health conditions. There are at least 30 studies that I know of, and we've seen some of them quoted today. And rather than go through all of those 30 studies, which isn't really my style, they're there. And as I keep saying, go and start this research for yourself and work out which path you want to travel. There's a significant role for ketogenic diets in the role of epilepsy. They've been used for the best part of 90 years. The same thing with diabetes. It's the original management of diabetes. Fabulous, very tight control. Yes, it was a bit hard to eat ketogenic and have no carbohydrate when you didn't have all the options that we've got traditionally, or the options that we've now got today. But there's also a role for cancer therapy, and we're going to talk about that tomorrow. There are places called longevity cultures. You might have heard of blue zones. Dan Buettner described these. And these are cultures around the world where the people live for a very, very long time. Okay, they live into their 90s and 100s and they die of old age. And these have been studied as cultures to try and work out what they're doing right. What are they eating which is making a big difference? And the important factor here is to look between the lines and see what they're not eating. And what they're not eating is processed food. They're not eating sugar, they're not eating highly refined carbohydrates. They're definitely avoiding polyunsaturated oils. They also have a strong strength of spirituality and community spirit and low stress levels, coming back to the cortisol. These things work. We've got some intervention studies, even if they are called historical. So in my mind, where does it leave us? Well, I actually think I'm convinced that the combination, and again, it's not just carbohydrate, it's not just sugar, and it's not just polyunsaturated oils. When you put them all together, we've created a toxic material which is highly inflammatory. Sure, the other stuff comes in again, right? That's the small print. People ask me about all of this other small print all the time. I say, get the basics right, get the building blocks right, and then you're okay. So I do think that modern food is a weapon of mass destruction. I do think that modern disease is based on inflammation. And if we look at the cause of that inflammation, we then have a model to go forward with and prevent all modern disease. I do think it's toxic. I think by themselves they're not a problem, but I do think it's time to put out the inflammation. So what's the answer? It's real food, okay? I get asked regularly, what do I eat? And I say, it's really simple. When the pizza comes out, I'm the guy who eats all the topping. I'm eating all the meat, the vegetables, the colour, the flavour, the textures and all that joy. And if you actually want to eat the pizza base, which is going to go straight onto your backside, then you enjoy that. And I challenge people, my patients in particular, I say, well, look, if you really think carbohydrate's important, have a bowl of pasta by itself. Have bread by itself, have potato by itself. It's all the other stuff we put on top. Now, I've worked out what bread is. And if you've seen what bread is, seen a slice of bread? It's actually a method of transporting food from your plate to your mouth. That's all it is, right? So if you want to put something in it, I use a piece of lettuce, okay? But there's a modern invention that came out recently. I don't know if you've got it here in South Africa. Actually, I think you do. It's called a fork and a spoon, right? And they work quite effectively for transporting food from your plate to your mouth. So it is about eating real food, getting away from the processed food. I'm a great believer in eating in a mindful fashion. I use that term regularly, mindful. Think about where your foods come from. Think about the transport miles. Think about eating locally and seasonally and naturally. It's a really good start. I do think we need to cut down significantly our sugar and refined carbohydrates. I'm not talking about missing out on vegetables. That's proper, that's good carbohydrate. But it's low amounts for the amount of effort that you've got to put into it. I think we need to be eating healthy fat. We need to replace that loss of energy and fuel with healthy fats. I think we need to leave our protein levels at a normal level. Okay, we don't need to up it. We don't need to jump enormous amounts because that also has an insulin effect. It also has a protein, an amino acid load as well. And that's where I think some of the high protein diets have gotten into trouble from a renal clearance aspect. I do think we need to minimise our intake of polyunsaturated oils. We need a tiny, tiny amount of omega-3 in the system. We need a tiny amount of omega-6 and omega-9. And what we've done is we've drowned our systems in polyunsaturated oils. And the body's only got one thing to do with that excess product. It's store it in our membranes and our LDL particles and then oxidise it. So my parting message is sugar makes you hungry. Carbohydrate makes you fat, and polyunsaturated oils make you inflamed and sick. I couldn't be here without the help of a lot of people. Okay? I like playing with jigsaw puzzles, always did as a kid. I'm now an orthopaedic surgeon, and when you come in off a motorbike, then I put the jigsaw puzzle back together. And this whole topic is just a jigsaw puzzle waiting for the pieces to put together. I don't have every one of those jigsaw pieces in there, but I've got a pretty good idea of the picture at the moment. And it's a lot clearer than it was 3 years ago, 5 years ago, and 10 years ago. And as a result of that, I misnamed my website nofructose.com. But it really reads badly when you've got to say cut down on sugar and polyunsaturated oils and refinedcarbohydrate.com. So thank you very much for your time. I have left some time for questions and I'm very happy to take them. Thank you.